Hi everyone, I'm back at the chain of infection, and we've been talking about the infectious agent and some of the characteristics of that infectious agent that will contribute to causing disease. So I wanted to go backwards and just mention the concept of susceptible host. And you're familiar with this idea that not every pathogen affects everybody the same way. In fact, there's certain pathogens that some groups of people are more susceptible to than others. Sometimes we hear about children that are very young are more likely to get certain diseases. So the susceptible host might be somebody very young. Sometimes it's because those young people don't yet have antibodies to the disease, and other people have been exposed to the disease in the past or in the infection in the past and have an immune response to it. Sometimes people that are older are more susceptible to certain pathogens. And just like we age on the outside, we age on the inside. Our immune systems become less responsive. And for some pathogens, for example, influenza and even COVID-19, older people seem to be somewhat more susceptible to that. So they were the susceptible host. The susceptible host may also be somebody who's immunocompromised. We talked about opportunistic pathogens are able to infect immunocompromised people, but not a healthy individual. Also, the conditions under which a person lives can affect if they're a susceptible host or not. Living in crowded conditions might put you under more stress and expose you to more pathogens and make you a susceptible host. If living in conditions where you're not maximizing your health can contribute to getting infectious disease. And sometimes people live in areas where there have been natural disasters, things like that. And again, those kind of conditions can contribute to making people susceptible hosts. So it just depends on the situation, the person, and the infectious agent, who's a susceptible host. The other next chain of infection the next link to the chain of infection that we're going to talk about is the reservoir. Here is the table 11.4 from your textbook, and it talks about the different reservoirs. And so I wanted you to differentiate between the living and non-living reservoirs. The two main reservoirs would be listed here, living and non-living. So first of all, what do we mean by a reservoir? And a reservoir is going to be where a pathogen can live and reproduce. So one of the things when the COVID-19 pandemic was starting is people wanted to know, where did it come from? What is the reservoir? And they talked about this even in the news. It was a very important characteristic of the disease to help us prevent the introduction of that pathogen to as many people as possible. So if you know where the pathogen comes from, it can give you a tool to help deal with preventing the spread of that pathogen. And so the reservoir where that organism naturally lives, we have living reservoirs, and they can be in animals. So there's a lot of pathogens that are transferred from animals to humans. And one of the things with COVID-19 is one of the common theories is that the virus originally lived in bats. And we've heard of other pathogens that come from animals. We know rabies is a reservoir. Lots of animals are reservoirs to rabies. And there's different kinds of influenza that birds are the reservoir. There's salmonella poisoning. A lot of salmonella, like food poisoning, can come from all sorts of reptiles. So there's lots of different animals that act as reservoirs. In this handout, in this table, they have arthropods as separate from animals, but arthropods are insects. So insects are also a good, important reservoir for disease. And different things we can get malaria from insects carrying it. We can get Lyme disease, and sometimes these pathogens actually live and reproduce in those arthropods. So living reservoirs, we have animals, we have arthropods, insects, but the most common reservoir, if you sit there and you think about any disease that I've ever gotten, where did it come from? and most of those came from other people. So humans are our most common reservoir of disease, and lots of infections come from them. So, we get colds and flus and COVID-19 and all sorts of things from other humans. So our living reservoir, animals, including insects, and humans are quite common. There also are some infectious diseases that we get from non-living reservoirs. And what we mean by non-living is things like soil, water, and I would just say primarily soil and water. And so these are, again, organisms that can live in the soil and water, and we acquire those pathogens through those from those reservoirs. And so, I can think of Clostridium tetani, that the bacteria that causes tetanus lives in the soil, and Clostridium botulinum lives in the soil too. There's all sorts of different fungi that live in soil, and so there's lots of different organisms that have a non-living reservoir, specifically the soil. Cholera is, I would probably describe as the world's worst diarrhea. That bacteria typically is found in some places in the water. And so water is one of the reservoirs for cholera, although sometimes people will get it from other humans. So that can have a reservoir of humans also. So the reservoir is going to be where the pathogen normally lives and reproduces. When we're talking about reservoirs, we talk about humans being, having humans that are actively ill, and that's an obvious, makes them an obvious reservoir for infectious disease. But in some cases, the human doesn't appear to be sick, and they can still be a reservoir. What we call in a case like that, we call it, we say that the person is a carrier of that pathogen. And what can happen when you're a carrier? Here, this is again a table from your book, table 11.5, and a carrier can be asymptomatic, meaning they're just not showing any signs or symptoms of the disease. They're infected but show no symptoms. And that happens frequently with, they have some examples here of sexually transmitted diseases. If somebody was actively very sick from a sexually transmitted disease and had active sores and things, you might be more alerted to that and might not, they might not get anybody to have intercourse with them, so they're not going to spread the disease. So a lot of sexually transmitted diseases have the patient isn't infected, but they're asymptomatic, and in some cases can still transfer that pathogen to someone else. This is, the incubating carrier is an example of somebody who's can spread the pathogen before they, it's developing in them, but they're not actively sick yet. You can see that there's all different kinds of carriers, and you don't have to necessarily know all these different kinds, but just be aware that a carrier is going to be somebody, in most cases, that's infected but not showing signs and symptoms of disease. Here we have this term chronic carrier, and you might have heard the story of Typhoid Mary, and she ended up, this was I think around 1915, around there, and she spread typhoid fever to families that she worked for. She worked as a cook, and she carried Salmonella typhi. She didn't know she was carrying this, and she was never sick, but she was able to shed it. So she was a carrier and could spread this to other people, and some people even died of it. So that's kind of the idea of being a carrier. Another concept related to the reservoir of disease is the concept of a zoonosis. A zoonosis is an infectious disease that you can acquire from an animal. So we said the two major reservoirs for infectious disease in humans are living and non-living. And so one group of the living would be animals. So those diseases that can be passed to humans by animals are called zoonoses. Singular zoonosis, plural zoonoses, or we would say they are zoonotic diseases or zoonotic infections. And so here's some examples. We can get different viruses, bacteria, or other microbes from animals. And we've already mentioned things like rabies, influenza, we can get it from birds, yellow fever, wild birds, mammals, mosquitoes, West Nile virus, mosquitoes, wild birds. So these diseases would be zoonotic viruses. Bacteria, different things. We're all familiar with things like, leptospirosis. Your domestic animals can get that. Anthrax. Brucellosis is a not common, but it's not uncommon disease that cattle and sheep and pigs can get, and it causes you to be really tired. Plague, and yes, there still is some plague around, but we can treat it with antibiotics so we don't have big epidemics of it. Salmonellosis, like I mentioned. So there's lots of different bacteria. Lyme bacteria would be another one. And some other microbes. Ringworm is caused by a fungus. Toxoplasmosis and trypanosomiasis are different protozoans. Tapeworms, all of these would be considered zoonoses or zoonotic diseases. We can transfer them. Their reservoir is an animal, and they can be transferred to humans. At that point, I'm going to stop, and we'll go to the next video.